Hey, Seawolf community, Chancellor Sandine here with another segment of Ask a UAA Expert. Take a look.
I'm Sally Carraher. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology here at UAA. I'm a medical anthropologist, and all of my work is community-based and focused on northern communities in Alaska and Canada. Today I'm going to be talking about how pandemics affect culture and society and kind of focus on the northern aspect of that. How is this pandemic similar and different than what we've seen before? The coronavirus, which is causing COVID-19, is different in some ways in that it's a novel coronavirus, and in some of the genetic and evolutionary features of the pathogen. But a lot of the ways that it's having impacts on people and society are actually really similar to what we've seen before. It may not feel like that, because it's been many decades since we've had a very serious pandemic in North America. But even previous pandemics, like in the early 2000s with SARS, or later with MERS, most recently with Ebola and Zika, some of the same sorts of social reactions that we've seen in the public are really similar. And those, I think, are a normal feature of how people are reacting to the stress and the drama, as well as the very real fear that people have for these pandemics. So for example, we look to the archival records, and we can see in newspapers and old clippings from the early 1900s and even in the 1800s that there's been concern before over economic scarcity or the economic impacts of a pandemic. There's been concerns about resource scarcity. In fact, there's been advertisements that have been placed in old newspapers in the 1800s, late 1800s, from the Russian influenza, as it was called at that time, in 1889, 1890, and then again almost 30 years later with the really big one, with the 1918 influenza pandemic, which at that time was called the Spanish influenza. We see advertisements taken out by government, for example, in Canada and the USA, warning people to not hoard resources and take things away from needed medical personnel or people who really need them. So we know that that has happened before. We know also that the ways that people talk about pandemics in North America has been pretty consistent for over 100 years. And so when we think about 1918 influenza, that was overlapping with the tail end of World War I, the first war. And there was a lot of rhetoric and a lot of metaphors at that time. People were framing this worldwide scourge in terms of it being an enemy that we have to fight, and in terms of us fighting a war against against a disease. They didn't know it was caused by a virus yet back then. So we're still seeing that today. I've seen our current president, as well as presidents past, as well as our surgeon generals and our governors and our other health officials talking about how we have to fight this war. And I think that metaphor can be really helpful in some ways. Like just last week, I think former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy described the war that we're fighting in terms of sending our medical personnel into battle without appropriate armor, or without any armor on. And that was in reference to the lack of personal protective equipment, or PPE, and the lack of ventilators and adequate resources for our hospitals. And so I think this metaphor can be helpful in some ways in terms of giving people a way to make meaning out of it, a way to make sense out of it, and to help kind of mobilize a patriotic, even sort of effort for us to all come together and do the right thing. However, war metaphors are also really problematic, and one of the ways that they're problematic is if you think that we're fighting a virus, and the virus is the enemy, and you think that that virus originated in a certain place or within a certain population of people, then that metaphor really becomes very harmful because it contributes to xenophobia and to racism. And we're definitely seeing that right now against people of Asian descent or perceived Asian association. And that's why health officials don't name pandemics or epidemics after geographic locations anymore. If you look at the past several decades with SARS or Ebola or Zika or swine flu or avian flu, they're not naming them anymore after places that we think they originate from. And this is, I think, to help dissuade people from engaging in that type of incorrect and racist associations of viruses or pathogens with groups of people. However, we haven't seen that metaphor, that fear go away yet, and so it's really not helpful when people try to relate this virus to a so-called Chinese virus. It's not helpful, and it's also not true biologically. The virus is not a person. The virus doesn't have a culture. People of all cultural backgrounds and races and geographic origins are all at risk for this. So that's all the same. But what I think is different is just the speed at which today we share information with each other and the kinds of information that gets shared widely. And so I think one of the really impactful and powerful things that every single one of us can do right now as an individual is just think about when you're on social media before you click or share something, just think about in terms of, is this accurate information? Do I know for sure? And also, is this information helpful? Like, is it going to assuage people and give them better information or give them an idea of what to do? Or is this going to make people panic, or is this going to make things worse? And so just kind of like social distancing can reduce the spread and the impact of the virus by taking people out of that chain of infection. Just taking a moment to pause and think, should I click on this? Should I like this? Should I share this? Is a way that we can help to reduce the flow of inaccurate or harmful information in social media and leave more space open for the accurate and helpful information from, legit sources. One of the things that we're seeing right now is concern in our rural communities, and a lot of rural communities have been wanting to restrict travel in and out of the community, mostly into the community, out of a very legitimate fear and a memory of how epidemics have come from outside in the past and wiped out entire families and communities. And some of the elders who are living today were little kids when they remember some of these last few major epidemics that we had in our colonial history. And that's really important for us to remember where people are coming from and where their fears are from. So I think some of the reaction we're seeing in Alaska is based not only on trying to assess the situation today, but out of a memory of how bad things have gotten in the past, and what that means for people. I saw, for example, a really awesome meme online which was released here in Alaska that shows like a vector image of an elder wearing a kuspek, and it says, the message is, for Alaska Native peoples and communities, and it says that we need to protect our elders by observing social distancing. And so I think a lot of the messaging that we're seeing in the state right now is really helpful, because especially if it plays to our collective memories as Alaskans and speaks to our history, as well as speaking to the situation we find ourselves in today. We're not at all the same as New York City. We're not at all the same as Seattle. And so the way that we respond to this pandemic, it has to be based on the resources that we have available here today. Another thing that really has affected us in our history is become part of our cultural identity in some ways, and that is the 1925 diphtheria epidemic, which hit Nome, Alaska particularly hard, and is the reason that they did the serum run in 1925, where they had teams of dog sleds and people moving in between communities from south central Alaska up to Nome, and that route has become the historic Iditarod racing route. So one of the positive messages that I take from that serum run in 1925 is this is a really great example of Alaskans across the territory at that time or across the state today, mobilizing the resources that we have, the people resources and the cultural resources, as well as back then it was a radio system. Today it's largely social media and other forms of online media, but really mobilizing around who are we as Alaskans and how are we all connected to each other in this really large state where we are spread out very far away from each other, and how do we help each other. So I think if we look back to how people came together in 1925 for diphtheria, as well as how people mobilized the CHAPS program here in response to tuberculosis in the mid-20th century, that those are two really good examples of how we can just look at who we are as people in Alaska and our diverse cultures and our diverse communities, and what resources do we have and how do we help each other the best. How might this pandemic end up changing society or having an impact on our culture? One of the things about pandemics, or just big epidemics in general, is that they work socially as revealers. They kind of shine a spotlight on cracks that are in our system. Because when a pandemic or a new disease hits a society, it's hitting a society that's built a certain way and functions a certain way. And they almost never function totally perfectly. So some of the revelations that we're seeing from this pandemic right now, nationally as well as specifically in Alaska, is that there are a lot of people who live and work and go through their daily lives in our system who are not adequately represented and not adequately covered by our social safety nets that do exist. So for example, in Alaska we have really high seasonal employment, seasonal unemployment, chronic under and unemployment, a lot of types of careers that people do that are not eligible for traditional unemployment benefits. It's everything from your tattoo artist to your hairdresser to your massage therapist to independent contractors and consultants in a variety of disciplines, to a lot of work that is done out on the land and related to subsistence, be that personal or commercial. So we're seeing that. We're also seeing with the hunker down order in Anchorage and the statewide social distancing order, that there are a lot of people who are not able to adequately comply with those orders by no fault of their own. So we need to think about that in the future moving forward, not just as preparing for future possible epidemics or pandemics, but also just in general, what kind of Alaska do we want to live in the 21st century, and what kind of place do we want to have for all the people who live here in our communities, from the smallest community to the largest one here in Anchorage. So some of the people who are having a really hard time now are students, especially students who have had to be moved out of their dormitory housing, people who don't have adequate employment or don't qualify for unemployment benefits or other social safety nets, people who don't have stable housing in the first place. We're having a problem right now with the issue of shelter, and trying to find creative solutions for that, especially maintaining healthy social distancing while delivering those shelter options for people. And I think these are all things that we're going to have to think about after the pandemic is over and everything starts to return to normal. We need to ask ourselves, well, what kind of normal do we want to have? And maybe let's think more about making that an inclusive back to normal for everyone.